regulation needed to enforce a ban on engineered stone is being considered by Safe Work Australia. It follows a meeting of workplace health and safety ministers who want to see the material prohibited over its contribution to the deadly disease silicosis. Joining me live now is Labor MP and Dr Michelle Ananda-Rajah. Thanks very much for your time. So at this stage it's being pushed off 6 months of consideration. Are you disappointed the minister federally wasn't a bit more urgent on this?
No, not at all, Tom. Look, silicosis is a really serious disease. It is a preventable disease and it's due to primitive workplace practices. Now, as a doctor, this is a disease that I only read about in medical textbooks. And I thought it was really a historical footnote associated with poor mining practices in years gone by. And so really to see this resurgence of this disease affecting particularly Australians of working age is absolutely devastating. So I think what was achieved yesterday with the federal and state ministers in concert is actually a really positive step, because reading between the lines, they're clearly moving towards a ban of this engineered stone product, and I think it's long overdue.
How did it happen? I mean, you mentioned you thought this was one consigned to the textbooks or really poor construction practices, because you can, of course, get it just from concrete and tunnelling and so on. This product with 95% silica, why didn't we think straight away, well, either that's too high or it needs to have really stringent practices around it in terms of PPE and water while any cutting is happening?
It's a really good question. I think this probably has something to do with the types of operators that are using this. So these tend to be, small shop front type operators, which are harder to police, harder to monitor, harder to enforce. Whereas in construction or mining, the regulator goes in, and if there are any breaches, the whole site, indeed the whole company, can be held liable and the site can be shut down. So I think this has flown under the radar for a long time. I do wonder what has happened with Safe Work Australia's oversight of this problem, because I do know for a fact that campaigners, families, even victims and unions have been asking for, close to a decade, if not longer, for action to be taken on this front. So those questions are a bit of an unknown, but I think the important thing now is that we all recognise that this is a really serious problem. And as someone who has worked in a lung transplant centre in a major hospital in Australia, in Melbourne, I can tell you that it is no joke when your only recourse is lung transplantation. Yeah,
there's been some pretty heartbreaking stories on it. Do you have a view on the percent of silica that it should cut out at? What would be safe? I guess what would be manageable in terms of practices around it to stop serious disease?
Yeah, good question. I'm a little hesitant to put a threshold on this, because as a doctor, my only concern is, well, what is the safe dose of silica? And it always comes down to dose. And that dose can be a big inhalation of a high concentration, or it can be inhalation of a low concentration over a long period of time. So I don't think we should get too caught up on the concentration of silica in the actual product. What is actually important here is what is going to be the risk of exposure for that worker over a period of time. And that also means then we need to look at the hazard controls that are put in place at these workplaces, and more importantly, whether we can actually effectively enforce them. Now, there is no point in handing down legislation if you can't actually monitor and enforce, and that is where things have broken down in this industry. So we need to be able to be confident that we can enforce. If we can't be confident, and that is how I see things right now, then the only move is to enforce a outright ban, and that is something that is now being considered.
Yeah, okay. So the union, just finally and briefly, is saying total ban from middle of next year if the government doesn't sort this out. Is that a fair enough approach to take?
I don't think it's unreasonable, actually. I mean, the unions are there to advocate for their workers, and these workers have fallen through the cracks. It's too late for over 100,000 workers already who have developed silicosis. It's an irreversible condition. And so the unions are stepping up and really pushing hard to see this banned. Now, it falls to us as governments, both subnational and Commonwealth, to make sure this happens. And I think that's where we're moving towards. Would I like to see 6 months reduced? Of course I would. But it's now, the ball is in Safe Work Australia's court to come up with a credible solution to preventing this from ever happening again. It shouldn't be happening in 2023. It's completely preventable.
Dr. Michelle Ananda-Rajah, thanks for your time.
Pleasure. Thanks, Tom.